Hey, good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Duncan Robb. I am the Chief Policy Advisor here at the State Department of Education.
This is Carlyn Laraway. I'm the Director of Assessment.
And we're here today with you all to talk about the state's consolidated plan under the Every Student Succeeds Act. So during this webinar, we have some slides for you, but we're certainly, part of the reason why we're doing this is to be able to answer questions and, even more importantly, collect your feedback on the details we're presenting. Where we are in the process right now is such that we still have opportunity to make changes to what's in the plan. There's still ongoing review of the details, and we want to make sure that we have the opportunity to incorporate additional feedback ongoing. So there we go. So just as far as using the webinar, we have this set up so everybody is muted. However, at any time you can type questions into the question box there on the GoToMeeting, and we'll be able to see it on our end. We'll be taking pauses throughout the presentation to answer any questions that we see, and then we'll have more, and then we'll answer questions at the end as well. So plenty of time to answer questions, take your feedback, and so on. And we're happy to respond to that. Anything that we either don't get to during the webinar because there's so many questions or things to note, or things that you think of afterwards, we're happy to address those at that time. So at that point, I think it's time to jump right in, and I'm going to toss it to Carlyn to kick us off.
So we'll get started here and just talk a little bit about what the Consolidated Plan is. Essentially, all states must apply to the Department of Education in order to receive federal funds to serve disadvantaged students. So quite simply, the Consolidated Plan is the application for these federal education funds covering 9 program areas schools use schools with at-risk populations of students. The application describes the priorities and use of funds for each of the 9 programs covered by the law and focuses on one of the department's strategic goals that all stakeholders are mutually responsible for student achievement and success. The plan also describes how the state will differentiate schools by identifying schools for improvement and support, and that's the lowest 5% of Title I schools, publicly report school progress in the form of the report card, provide assistance to Title I schools, fund and facilitate professional development for educators, and support other at-risk student populations. So here's a look at the 9 federal programs involved in the plan. As you can see, our allocation for federal funds under ESSA is about $83 million. This is based on the appropriations law for the 2017-18 school year. Preliminary allocations from the President's budget proposal would eliminate funding of Title II Part A and Title IV Part A in the 18-19 school year. So these federal funds, this $83 million, supplements the state's $1.7 billion investment for K-12 education. The plan begins with Title I Part A, which addresses 2 major components: challenging academic standards and assessments, which is merely an assertion statement in the plan and does not require a response. And then statewide accountability, systems and school support and improvement activities, which is what this webinar will focus mostly on, school accountability. The school supports will be addressed during the webinar in a couple of weeks. So much of the discussion around our accountability centers on the state-determined long-term goals and measures we use to obtain an understanding of school success and challenges, and our methodology for identifying low-performing schools for support. As we get into the section of the plan during the webinar, we wanted you to have some guiding questions to keep in mind, although we're happy to answer any questions you type into the chat box as you go through. So please kind of keep these in mind, and I'll pause at the end of the long-term goal section and revisit this. But are these long-term goals ambitious and achievable? And if not, how can we modify our long-term goals? What else is important for us to know whether a school is successful? What would we like to see for school indications? And is the targeted support and improvement methodology fair? Is the definition of a consistently underperforming school reasonable, or underperforming subgroup reasonable? So to start off with, N size is the count of students that's required to run calculations for accountability. And this has been set historically going back to the 5-star rating system as an N count of 25, which means if students have 25 in their system of all students or in a small subgroup, this would be reflected in their accountability calculations. Under ESSA, this has to be statistically sound, and when we consider N counts, we're always looking for a way to eliminate any distractions or noise. And by noise, I mean if a school has only 5 or 6 students and we did not have an N size of 25, let's just say there was no N size reported, we would, if the student, the highest performing student in that school missed the test for that school year, could have a significant impact on overall school performance with just that few number of students. So an N size helps to eliminate any of those kind of high variances that we're really trying to avoid in capturing accountability when we're looking at trends over time. Also, whenever considering our N size, we're making sure that we're not revealing any personally identifiable information. This slide says the N size for reporting is 10, but it's actually 5. The DMC just recently made a motion, and the state board approved last week at their meeting a shift in the reporting N size to 5. So schools that have 5 or more students in a particular subgroup would be reported publicly on the report card. So if there's any questions about N size, we'll keep going. The description of long-term goals begins on page 11 in the plan. Under No Child Left Behind, all states were held to goals established by the Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education, and that requirement was 100% of students would be proficient by 2014. Under ESSA, states now set that long-term ambitious goals, and that's where our flexibility comes in. So our long-term goals are required for academic achievement, graduation rate, and increase in English learners making progress towards English proficiency within a state-determined timeline. And these goals also have to include measurements of interim progress. Keep in mind that ESSA requires goals for all students in all subgroups to cover the same length of time, and it places a high priority in establishing goals that close achievement gaps. In setting our long-term goals, we asked stakeholders to help us identify principles to guide these determinations, and it was important that the goal be easy to calculate, easy to explain, and understand. Stakeholders also wanted our goals to reflect high expectations for all students and set goals that would be applicable to all schools. So given these principles, our long-term goals will be to reduce the percentage of non-proficient students by half over 6 years. And 2016 will be serving as the base year, taking us out to 2022. The long-term goal for graduation rate is the same, reduce the percentage of non-graduates by 50% in 6 years, again with 2016 serving as the base year. And we'll go into this a little bit more in the next couple of slides so you can actually see the calculation. In 2016, we implemented a new English language proficiency assessment, and in 2017, new cut scores were established. So this has put us at a disadvantage in determining an English language proficiency long-term goal, as we would really love to have 2 years of data to establish that goal, but we received direction just a few months ago that we would have to establish long-term goals or our plan would be returned. So you'll note on page 14 of the plan that we're working on those goals now, and we hope to have those out for public comment with stakeholder feedback, and Christine and Nava's team will take the lead on gathering some input from English learner, those who serve the English learners population, and particularly those familiar with the assessment as well. All right, let's look at this, how this goal plays out a little bit. Just one more comment though, recent feedback on that long-term goal, and I'll go back, that's important to point out. On page 11 in the plan, if you're following along, the goal for all students would be to improve proficiency 23.5 percentage points over 6 years, whereas the long-term goal for students with disabilities is over 40 points. And we heard from stakeholders there's concerns that some might just dismiss this goal as unattainable or too ambitious and not realistic, and that we're setting people up for failure. But considering the emphasis ESSA places on closing achievement gaps, and those principles that stakeholders identified were important. This is the only model that checked off all the principles that we felt were important and that was required under ESSA. We also have considered and would love feedback on less aggressive approaches in this current model, such as lowering the reduction percentage from 50% to 25%, or perhaps increasing the number of years to reach this long-term goal from 6 to 8 or even 10 years. However, it was noted that 6 years is half of a child's K-12 career, and a 50% reduction is straightforward in calculating the measures of interim progress, as you'll see in a couple minutes. So before we move on, I'm curious if there's any comments or questions. Are these long-term goals ambitious and achievable? And if not, how can we modify these given the requirements under ESSA? And we'd love your feedback. So if you have any comments, you can type them in the questions box rather than the chat box. I think that's how we're doing it. Unless we have the chat box open. Oh, yes. So we've been asked to repeat the goal for special ed students. So this is on page 11 of the plan. And the long-term goal with 2016 serving as the baseline is to reduce the percentage of students not proficient by half over 6 years, which means, and I don't know the numbers offhand because I'm not looking at the plan specifically, but Marcia has it right here, so I will grab it. All students, special ed students in 2016 where 15% of our special ed students were proficient or advanced in 2016. And in 2022, we would increase that to 57.5%. And that is obviously an increase of over 40 percentage points. Now, whether or not that's realistic or attainable is the big question on the table. And I think that's where we would really love your feedback. Can you read the rest of those?
The end size for reporting purposes seems too low. Why wouldn't we have the same end size for accountability and for reporting purposes? Having different end sizes may cause confusion, and a 5 for reporting will not protect student confidentiality in small districts.
Okay, so Nick Smith, thank you for your comment about the end size. That takes us back a little bit. Having a different end size for reporting and accountability calculations, you're right. Particularly, that's a concern for the number of schools that are then not factored into accountability. We have about 150 Title I schools and 138, and I could have those numbers reversed, in the numbers of schools identified using 25 as an end count. The lower that end count goes, the more schools we pick up for accountability calculations. So you're right. Having a different number for reporting and accountability is allowed under ESSA. And primarily the reporting requirements are driven by the Data Management Council. So we follow that lead, but certainly the end size for accountability can be changed. And so we're in the position of open discussion on that, and we'd love feedback. Again, we're trying to minimize noise. So if we have a low end size for accountability, it's possible that a school can take a very large, I hate to say it, but a large hit for one student performance if the student is missing the test, or if a student that's expected to be a high achieving student has an off day and the test result isn't as expected. That can have a negative impact when we're trying to identify schools using that. But for the long-term goals and for end size, I think that's where we're headed. I'd certainly open to that, and we'd love feedback. Some discussions when the DMC reviewed that was to take the end size from 10 to 5 and then take the accountability end size down as well. So we could certainly run some statistical numbers on that. I think we have one from Don Nesbitt. Does this include subgroups? Don, I'm not sure when you say does this include subgroups what you mean. The long-term goals are applicable to all subgroups as well as end size. So if you want to expand on your question, I'm happy to answer it. And then Amy has a question about what supports will special education have in reviewing goals for IEPs? We will be working with the special ed department and the special education supports and technical assistance team, SESTA, over at Boise State to align, these long-term goals in assessment results with goals for IEPs. And obviously IEP goals are written for individual students based on a student's starting point. So while the long-term goal isn't specific to students, it's specific to statewide averages of students. When it comes to a subgroup, it certainly trickles down. And so we'll be working with our special ed teams to make sure that we have those supports in place and that we're revisiting and making sure that our goals at the state level are apparent in writing goals for IEPs for individual kids. Okay, a couple more questions here. Nick's question we answered on end size. So if you have a suggestion, Nick, on end size, if you'd like to see us do 5 or 10 or throw it out there, put it out in a comment here. It is hard to make a disabled child undisabled. Yes, it is. We would suggest that you use the larger end size for both. Oh, okay. So the larger end size, so reporting is not necessarily set by the accountability plan, it's set by the Data Management Council. So we could certainly take it under advisement, but the Data Management Council just proposed an end size of 5 for reporting for students, and that would be public reporting. So we would go back and see if we have options there, but I don't believe we have many options in the reporting. The end size for accountability, we do.
We don't want it, and their goal is to not suppress so many cells.
And our goal in the reporting is to open up, the data to be publicly available as much as possible. And with data suppression, it's not just masking at 5, it's suppression across and down columns and over rows as well. So we are mindful that the Data Management Council is mindful that 5 is a relatively good number, although it doesn't open up a large number of cells for our smaller districts, it does. Okay, I think we've gotten those, and we'll put answers into this chat box and save these questions as well. So you'll have these as we go forward. All right, let's go back here to our presentation, and we'll pick up the long-term goals, and we'll walk through this and show you what it looks like a little bit more detail here. The difference in the long-term goal and the baseline divided by 6 years is how we would establish our interim progress goals. And so you can see here, using the example of the English language arts for all students that's found on page 11 in the plan, we would be using 76.5 is where we want to be in 6 years, minus the starting point, our baseline year of 2016 of 53 percentage points, and dividing that over 6. Which gives us an annual increase or expected annual growth of 3.92 percentage points. And then you can see how that leads to the long-term goal. With the baseline of 53% in 2016 and adding 3.92 to the next year and each year after up until 2022, we reach our long-term goal of 76.5% of students reaching proficiency in English language arts. Now again, this is for all students, so this would be replicated and is replicated in the plan, I believe, in the appendix for the student subgroups, for students with disabilities, and all of our major subgroup reporting, which includes the major racial and ethnic groups, as well as economically disadvantaged and English learners. So let's go back and check to see if there's any other questions. See if we can get here before we go on. Yep, we have one right here.
Rationale for end size
It suppresses the least amount of scores.
So the end size rationale for 25 was a statistical reliability. As I mentioned, when you're selecting an end count, you're really avoiding any kind of anomaly for one or two students over time that could have an effect on a particular school or a small group of schools or a small subpopulation of students. In addition to that, in stakeholder feedback, 25 was what we've used in under our ESEA waiver and with our 5-star accountability system. So it was a known number, and I think people could understand and knew that calculation well. Certainly, again, this is an area that is flexible, and Idaho can set this at whatever we feel is prudent and necessary. We're obviously trying to use this for accountability purposes in school identification as well as in our accountability system. So this plays a major factor and is a very big kind of the first point of decision when we're looking at that. So in our rural areas, schools with N size of less than 25 in a particular subgroup or small population of students, this would not factor, for that. This would play into a school that has a very small population of, or a low diverse population of students. And we are aware of some schools that have, in the tested grade levels, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th, let's say at an elementary school, or 3, 4, 5, where they don't even have 25 students altogether. So in looking at this number, certainly up for discussion and feedback, but I think the rationale was we've used it in the past, it's a statistically sound number, and it avoids any kind of distraction in data over time. Okay, we'll keep going, but feel free to continue typing your questions in the questions box, and we'll answer as much as we can as we go. And I'll pause again here in a minute. But we'll turn our attention now to the indicators. ESSA requires states to identify indicators which serve as the criteria for which schools are measured in 5 areas. Academic achievement, which is measured by the student achievement on the state's assessments in English language arts, math, and science. An other academic indicator, graduation rate, English language proficiency measured by the results of the English language proficiency exam for English learners, and a non-academic measure referred to as the school quality or student success indicator. We'll keep going here. The accountability framework is where you'll find Idaho's indicators approved by the legislature in March of this year. And as you can see, the framework first divides schools in 3 categories: K-8, high school, and alternative high schools. This framework covers all of the ESSA requirements for the academic achievement, other academic indicators, graduation rate, and English learner proficiency. In addressing the non-academic or school quality measures, Idaho's framework includes more than one in each school category. The non-academic indicator has been an area of both challenge and opportunity for states. Several states, including Idaho, are incorporating surveys into this measure, but critics question the validity and reliability of survey data. There's early evidence that the Department of Education has concerns with the use of surveys for accountability purposes, but our current plan will include submitting survey data as part of our school quality indicator. Several states, about 20, are using chronic absenteeism, but many of those states are using it as a placeholder until there are more advanced metrics available. And stakeholders in Idaho indicated this was not an indicator to pursue. The U.S. Department of Education template is configured such that we needed to include only those indicators we plan to use to identify schools for improvement. However, all indicators in the accountability framework are included in the reporting and will be detailed on the report card. And that takes us now to that system of reporting. ESSA requires states describe the system in which we differentiate all public schools in the state. And previously, this was done with the Idaho's 5-star rating system. Under the 5-star system, schools received a summative rating using all of the indicators to reach a broad claim or statement about school success. Stakeholder feedback encouraged the state to move away from this summative rating. That 5 stars or 2 stars don't tell the whole story, and in some cases, erroneously identifies a school as good or bad. Stakeholders also encouraged us to share more than just a final grade that ranks schools. So the strategy is to use the school report card, which displays data for each of the indicators in the framework, to allow stakeholders to see information about school performance across the areas policymakers have indicated are important, and then draw their own conclusions based on what they see. In other words, the report card will allow educators to draw their own conclusions and will not make the decision for them by presenting them with one rating. So ESSA requires that we use the indicators in our framework to identify at a minimum the lowest performing 5% of schools receiving Title I Part A funds for comprehensive school support and improvement. Rather than create a complicated model for identification using every indicator in the framework, which requires complex calculations that are inaccessible to parents and other stakeholders, the system for identification will incorporate achievement and growth for the required indicators of academic achievement, graduation rate, English learner proficiency, and a non-academic school quality measure. Our simple model of identification has received positive feedback from the field experts that reviewed our plans, including those from national groups. So in identifying the lowest performance, we wanted to avoid some of the issues in previous models of accountability, and I'm going to highlight two of them for you. First, the growth ceiling issue. Under previous calculations, it was possible for a very high-performing school to receive a lower rating due to a lack of growth, despite little room available for progress. And the low baseline issue existed for schools that had higher than average state average growth, but started out low and we call that a low baseline issue. So in identifying the models that we talked about, or avoiding these rather, you can see that we, using this table here, growth on the proficiency on the x-axis and growth on the y-axis. We wanted to find those schools not in those three quadrants there. The top right would indicate schools that have a high proficiency and high growth. The schools in the top left quadrant, although not a high proficiency to start with, are showing tremendous growth. We're really looking for the schools in this bottom left quadrant, which is a low proficiency, low performance, and low improvement or low growth. Okay.
So before we go any further, it looks like we have several questions we can try to tackle before we go into this demonstration into more detail about how the school identification system might work. So there are some questions about kind of school buckets and who would fall into what bucket. So
sorry, let's go back up. Let's start where we were here.
All right, so have we looked at alternative middle schools as a separate accountability area? So you saw the accountability framework and how it buckets schools. And throughout Idaho, there are schools that fall into unique situations that we would obviously need to go into more detail and create business rules for how the accountability system applies to that school. So we haven't created those rules yet. However, that's certainly one area that we're going to.
Yeah, let's back up. The alternative middle schools are not separated out in the accountability framework that was approved by the board. Only alternative high schools were approved for a separate accountability system. So alternative middle schools were not, and that was a decision by the Accountability Oversight Committee, the board, and approved by the legislature. The next question from Dale is, how does a sponsored alternative school fit into this as compared to a standalone alternative school? I guess, Dale, we need a little more clarification. A sponsored alternative school, if they are their own school number, if they operate under their own school ID, they would be considered an alternative school and would be in the alternative high school bucket for calculations and identified in that group. And then if they're receiving those alternative funds, that's how that would be identified. How is growth measured and how are student populations considered that are more transient. And this is from Amy. So growth is measured, you'll see here in just a minute, Duncan's going to review how we calculate growth for the school identification. In the accountability framework, the framework calls for a growth using a trajectory model, which is very vague and not defined enough, so requires a little bit more work from the state board in action in determining what the trajectory is. So, for instance, a trajectory model can be a 3-year trajectory or growth to proficiency by the end of 8th grade. So there's various ways to calculate growth using a trajectory model for individual students, and that has not been clearly defined by the board at this time in the framework as it currently exists. But for growth calculations at the school level for accountability purposes, you'll see that here in just a minute. So hopefully we'll answer that, but if we don't, we'll come back and revisit it. Don Nesbitt's question, is there any consideration for middle school alternative schools, which we've already answered. And then it says, is there, oh, same question. Okay, let's go down here. On page 23, we calculate the achievement percentile 42. On this calculation. On page 23 of the current draft, oh, different calculation, Don, if you're looking at growth or percentile, we'll come to that, and it's very well possible that, you know, it's that we'll cover that in just a minute, I believe. We will, I promise. Okay. Amy, you're welcome. Nick Smith. You got that one. All right. Let's see. The N size for reporting purposes seems too low. Why wouldn't we have the same N size for accountability? Okay, we've talked about that. Certainly the N size, again, as we said, is set by the DMC for reporting purposes. And an N size of 5 for reporting will not protect student confidentiality in small rural districts. Because of the masking rules set by the, it's not just N size of 5 for reporting, it's also masking at the cell level as well as at the group level or row and column level. So I can assure you, until we get to a count of 5 students in any row or column, additional fields are masked from reporting. So that has been taken under consideration when applying the N size of 5. We would suggest that you use the larger N size for both accountability. Okay, we will take that back. Again, the DMC sets the N size for reporting, so we're following their lead. I think that's it for questions.
No, Wendy Oldenkamp.
Oh, I'm sorry. Wendy Oldenkamp has a question about K-12 charter school. Would the school receive 2 separate scores, one for K-8 and one for high school, or just one score? If you have a high school and a graduation rate, you would fall under the high school reporting. Yeah, as long as you have one school number. If you're operating with one school number, if you have 2 school numbers, one for an elementary or K-8 and one for your high school. But if it's one school number, you would fall under the high school because you have a reporting graduation class, a graduating class. Okay, I think that's all of the questions so far. Keep them coming. We'll keep answering them. And I'll turn it over to Duncan to walk through how we're using school level performance to indicate achievement and growth.
All right, so tying it back to what Carlin was talking about before we were answering some questions. So our objective here with school identification, so identifying low-performing schools for improvement, which is a requirement under ESSA, was to really focus on those schools that are both showing low performance currently and are not improving. And so the next few slides will walk through sort of the methodology that we propose for doing that. So what you see here on the screen, you can also find on page 21 of the plan if you're following along. So you can see here that for school X, their math performance was 75% proficient in the current year. And so in the comparative data point for math showed that school X had 55% of their students reaching proficiency. So it went from 55% to 75%. So using a simple subtraction formula, we calculate the school's growth at 20 percentage points. So this goes back to that question about growth and transient students. This is not growth at a student level. This is growth at a school level, and a very simple calculation for school level growth at that. So for school X, their achievement is 75%. Growth is 20 percentage points. So using the data from step 1, we would then order schools for both their achievement and their growth. Here we go. And their growth. So as you can see in the table on the left, our school X is ordered at number 197 out of all schools for achievement. And on the right, based on their results for growth, they are ordered at number 2. So almost at the top in terms of how much they were able to improve from one year to the next. So in the next step here, in the third step, we divide the number of schools ordered below school X by the total number of public schools in the state. And that number is multiplied by 100, which is the procedure for calculating a percentile. So the percentile reveals the percent of schools in the state that fall below school X in achievement and that fall below school X in growth. So the result of these calculations, so outside of even the school identification system, the result of these calculations will just be displayed on the school report card. So that would allow everyone viewing the school report card to see both the results for achievement and growth for each indicator for each school. So then in step 4, we would choose the higher percentile for math. In this case, it's the 99th percentile as calculated in growth. So because the result was the most favorable for school X in growth, that's the percentile result that we choose for the school identification calculation. So we would repeat those steps that I just went over, steps 1 through 4, for each indicator, and then find the average, just average those across. In one actually detail there, though, that's relatively new to the plan, in the current version of the plan, we do propose capping the weight of the school quality indicator at 10% of the average, since it's a new and sort of unfamiliar data point. And one note that it makes sense to make here is that we can always revise the plan in subsequent years. So that would give us the opportunity to revise the weight of any indicator, including the school quality indicator, once we're sort of comfortable with it. But this 10 percentage point cap is one thing that we're sort of interested in what folks think when we average those indicators across, whether we should just do a straight average or cap the school quality indicator since it's new to the state of Idaho. So using the average of the indicator percentiles, we will order schools to identify the lowest 5% of Title I schools. And then the non-Title I schools that fall into the same range will also be included for comprehensive support and improvement. So that 5% is a requirement under the Every Student Succeeds Act. State funds will be used to support all schools identified. The Title I schools, which are the schools that serve a large number of disadvantaged students, will be eligible for additional federal funds in the form of school improvement grants. The U.S. Department of Education will not allow Idaho to replicate programming provided through federal dollars to schools serving disadvantaged students with other dedicated funds. So in other words, federal dollars must supplement and not supplant the support the state is already providing to all schools. So that restriction is meant to require states to provide additional support to schools serving disadvantaged populations and therefore close achievement gaps. And then also it should be noted here that under ESSO, it is a requirement that any school with a graduation rate less than 67% must be identified as a school for comprehensive support and improvement. And since we've gotten so many questions on end size, it's just kind of worth noting here. So this is an example where a higher N size for accountability makes it more likely that a school with a small graduating class won't kind of jump in and out of their graduation rate being reported for accountability purposes. So we would, what we're saying here with if we stick with an N size of 25 for accountability is that you would need at least 25 graduating students to be included in that 67% identification for graduation. So just a note there to link it back to some of the questions that we've been asked so far. So to explain the identification cycle, I'm going to deviate a bit from the order of the plan, but we'll reference page numbers for those of you who are following along. As we stated, ESSA requires states to identify no less than the bottom 5% of Title I schools for comprehensive support and improvement, and it allows states to select the first year of identification, so either 2017 or 2018. On this slide, you'll notice we're recommending that we start identifying in 2018 because and there are a few reasons for this. So first and foremost, there's a risk in identifying schools using the model in our plan before our plan is submitted and approved by the U.S. Department of Education. Additionally, just looking around the country and at the 17 states that submitted their plans in April, all of those states are looking to identify for the first time in 2018. Taking an additional year also allows us to fully test the stability of the model with 3 years of data, as we outlined in the plan, which can be done using de-identified data just to make sure that we're getting it right. Another reason to delay is that while the changes to the accountability framework garnered tremendous stakeholder feedback during the process, an important next step will be to communicate the accountability calculations in a meaningful way to stakeholders. We have proposed presentations at the IASA, ISBA, and Federal Programs Directors Conferences, as well as regional meetings. We can't stress enough the importance of transparency and understanding how the framework leads to school identification. The additional year gives the department and the board ample time to develop and publish business rules, guidebooks, and operational documents to support schools during the transition. And I'll note here that this was an objective for the beginning with school identification, that the process be transparent and clear and easy to understand even if you don't have an advanced statistics degree. So taking more time really even allows us to hopefully achieve that goal even more. And then keep in mind that even if we delay school identification, achievement data is still reported annually on the existing state LEA and school report card maintained by the State Department of Education. This resource allows all education stakeholders to continue to monitor outcome data of all schools, regardless of whether the lowest performing 5% are identified in 2017 or 2018. So getting back to our cycle of identification, comprehensive support and improvement schools will be identified every 3 years. This timeline determination came from stakeholder input that a 3-year cycle allows schools to develop and implement a plan with time to reflect on student achievement while also planning for the sustainability of improvement after the short-term funds to support the improvement strategies are no longer available to the school. The first year of a school's identification will be a planning year, which tasks that include conducting a comprehensive needs assessment and development of a school improvement plan as required by ESSA. The LEA may choose to implement its own needs assessment or ask the state to conduct the school's needs assessment. Then after the needs assessment, the school will complete a school improvement plan with an emphasis on identifying resource inequities. The plan will be approved by the local district and then sent to the State Department of Education for approval, and the district will oversee the implementation of the plan in the second and third year of the cycle with support from the State Department of Education where appropriate. And so we'll be talking even more about school supports in the third of these 4 webinars. So please stay tuned for that if you want to know more about how the department plans to support schools. And I'll do one slide and then I'll take some questions. It does not require that we identify any sort of high performing or reward schools. We had reward schools here in Idaho in the past. However, we, and this was a lot of folks when we were out there asked for this, we won't identify reward schools. However, what we're proposing to do in the plan is that on the school report card, if your school falls in the top 10% on any of the indicators, we'll note that and call it out and highlight that on the school report card. So it could be that, you know, of the many indicators, there are 3 or 4 that your school is in the top 10% in, and we would note that on the report card as sort of a way of saying, like, this is a high-performing school in this area. All right, so let's pause for some questions here and see what folks think about the identification model if we have any, though it looks like we might not have any new questions yet. Nope, we still have the latest question down there. So I'll pause just for a second and stall a bit to see if there's any thoughts, but we hope that you've seen in those last slides how that methodology would indeed lead to our identifying of those low-performing, not improving schools and really focusing the department's resources on those.
No new questions, so I think we can keep going.
We did appreciate, I saw a comment that the 10% cap on the school quality indicator is good to start with, so appreciate that feedback.
Yep.
All right. So if you think of any questions, just go ahead and
thanks, Don, for that clarification. We'll take a look at that in the example.
All right.
Dale, we'll come back and answer your question at the end here. I think I'll read that more closely, and we'll let Duncan keep going with the rest, but I'll take a look at that and hopefully get an answer for you on your alternative school specifically.
Perfect. All right. So as we mentioned earlier in the presentation, ESSA maintains the annual testing requirement for all students in grades 3 through 8 in high school. But instead of mandating punishment for schools not meeting the 95% participation requirement, ESSA allows the state to describe how we will factor in the 95% participation into our accountability system, which we do on page 27 of the plan. So under the 5-star rating system, schools that did not reach the 95% participation requirement were reduced in overall rating or essentially losing 1 star. We understand that in order to provide a fair and accurate picture of school success and help parents, teachers, and school leaders and state officials identify where students are struggling and how to support them, we must emphasize high participation in statewide assessments. As we embrace this flexibility, though, for the
We got way off track.
we lost it. All right, we're back. Nope, not back anymore. There we go. As we embrace this state flexibility as far as the 95% participation rate, we recognize that schools should not be punished for decisions made by parents regarding their children's education. So we emphasize in the plan a structure that encourages participation and provides support to schools that may need help. So for schools failing to meet the 95% participation requirement in 1 year, the first step that we will do, as you can see in this little flow chart here, is that we will average participation over 3 years. So if the school does not meet the 95% participation requirement over 3 years, then we'll do the following. We'll notify the local school board that the school hasn't met that requirement and require that the school develop a plan to improve participation. And the notation will appear on the school report card that the school or district has failed to meet the minimum standard of reporting and that therefore the achievement and outcome data displayed on the report card is not necessarily statistically sound or reliable. The State Department of Education will provide support to the local school districts with resources to engage stakeholders. Many of these resources are already available in our assessment participation toolkit on the department's website. So now on to, we talked about comprehensive support improvement. There's another category that ESSA requires we identify called targeted support improvement. So intent of ESSA is for states to use data to define consistently underperforming subgroups before identifying schools for targeted support and improvement with a focus on closing achievement gaps. However, nationwide, I would say Idaho included, many states are struggling with definitions because of a lack of data over time, since many states have recently changed assessments. Given the feedback to states that have submitted plans from the U.S. Department of Education already, it's clear that we need to include a definition in our plan, which we can always amend at a later date when additional data is available. So we're proposing a definition that you see here, that a consistently underperforming subgroup is one where the achievement gap exceeds 20 percentage points for 3 consecutive years. So just to go back a little bit, we need to define an underperforming subgroup in order to identify targeted support and improvement schools. And so that definition that we're proposing, and very much are eager and willing to accept feedback on it, is that a consistently underperforming subgroup is a subgroup where the achievement gap exceeds 20 percentage points for 3 consecutive years. And just to talk about what that gap is, what we're saying is the gap in performance from that group to the non-group. So, for example, the gap between the gap in achievement between English learners and non-English learners, as opposed to English learners and all students. So the gap between the group and the non-group. Using this or another methodology based on stakeholder input, we will identify schools for targeted support and improvement annually as required by ESSA beginning in 2018. So that takes us to the end of this section of the plan. So this webinar was dedicated to long-term goals and the accountability system, and we just went through the kind of the meat and potatoes of that part of the plan with you all. So here's what to expect next. The plan was released for official public comment period 3 days ago on Monday. Though we've been gathering feedback for essentially a year, but this is sort of ESSA requires that we have this 30-day public comment period, so that's what we're doing. So we at the State Department of Education will hold additional webinars to gather stakeholder feedback and answer questions on specific portions of the plan each of the next 4 Thursdays. So this is the first one, and then we will hold 3 more on the 29th, July 6th, and July 13th, all at the same time. And then we will incorporate final revisions and submit the final plan for the August board meeting, the State Board of Education meeting for approval. So then after the board approves it, we may incorporate a change or 2 based on that conversation, and then send the plan over to the governor's office no later than August 16th for Governor Otter's review and optional signature. And then after that, Superintendent Ibarra and Board President Clark will sign the plan, and SDE will submit to the U.S. Department of Education no later than September 18th. After the plan is submitted, the U.S. Department of Education has 120 days to review the plan. And then during that review, they may require revisions. So there have been some states recently that got feedback from the U.S. Department of Education. Those states were New Mexico, Nevada, and Delaware. I think it's safe to say that the education community was a little surprised with the volume of feedback that those states received. And so based on that development, we are looking at that feedback that those other states received and doing our best to preemptively answer questions that the U.S. Department of Education might have. However, it does seem well within the realm of likelihood that we will have the plan kicked back to us for clarifications or revisions during that 120-day period. We hope not, but based on early indications, it certainly seems possible. But more to come on that. We're doing our best there. So last but not least, we will throw those guiding questions up here again. Just to remind you that we really appreciate the active involvement from the participants so far. This has been some really great questions. and we'll use the remaining time we have to answer any additional questions. And before I turn it over to just some last-minute question answering, just a reminder, our next webinar next Thursday will cover the 5th indicator, the school quality and student success indicator, because that particular piece of the plan has just gotten so much attention both in Idaho and around the country. The 3rd webinar will focus on school supports, and the 4th webinar will focus on educator supports here upcoming. And then this webinar will be posted on the State Department of Education's website on our consolidated plan page here in the next day or two.
So I have some questions here, and I'll read them really quick. Does the state participation plan apply to subgroups, Dale? The answer is yes. 95% participation is required of all students and all student subgroups. Does ESSA allow for student growth indicators? ESSA allows for any flexibility the state would like to use in terms of student growth indicators. We do not have that factored into our school identification plan, but it is in the accountability framework using a trajectory model. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, that trajectory model needs to be clearly defined what we mean by that. So trajectory to growth to proficiency by 8th grade, or trajectory over 3 years, 5 years, 8 years, what's the trajectory model that we're using. But yes, ESSA allows for student growth indicators. We're using it in a very different way for school identification, but in the accountability framework it would be reported. Concerned about the 50% reduction in non-proficient for special education, and thank you for doing these webinars. Don, you're welcome. We share your concerns. Again, let's revisit those goals. Need to be ambitious, attainable, and the same over time for all students and all student subgroups. So while closing the achievement gaps is the focus, and so we share your concerns. If you have feedback on how we might have an ambitious goal that closes achievement gaps, but that may be more reflective of your concerns or address your concerns for the special education population or English learner population, that's where your feedback is critical. So we're happy to share some of our other data modeling. If you're interested in that offline, we can certainly share that. But I think that's a critical area. We need to set these goals. We need to have them be long-term with attainable and ambitious and close achievement gaps. But we're very open to suggestions on how we can do that in a way that works for all students. Sorry, the next question is a long question statement, so we can answer it offline. Okay, all of our goals and formulas are reasonable when you compare similar schools. Can the end size be differentiated by school size rather than one size fits all and still be statistically valid? Well, that's a really interesting conversation, and I am not a statistician. However, we have one in our team who is very good at this, and we could certainly run some numbers to look at school size as a way to identify end size. And I'll revisit the rules under ESSA if end size is applicable to all schools, or if we have some flexibility. Although we have seen some states do flexibility with end size when it relates to specific subgroups, where they might use 25 for all students, but 10 for instance, English learners. So we have some interesting conversations there. I'll take the rest of your comment and question offline, and we'll follow up separately. Amy, we look forward to having you on the next webinar. And Nick Smith, the last comment here is academic achievement and academic growth measured using only the ISAT, or does it include the IRI? So the IRI is in the framework from the board and the legislature approved accountability framework that's in state rule, but in school identification, we are not proposing to use the IRI, strictly just the ISAT math and English language arts assessments or student achievement. A couple of reasons for that to highlight right now. Initially, we're in a transition year with the IRI. This year we'll be administering the IRI to all of our students, but at the same time running a concurrent pilot with about 13,000 students. And in 18-19 school year, transitioning to the new IRI. So incorporating that now into accountability would be a start and stop gap, and anytime you change the assessment, you reset your accountability timeline. So we would not recommend using the IRI for school identification, but it will be something reported on the report card. is part of the accountability framework. You're right, it does just show page 17 just shows ISAT as we indicated for the school identification, but the frameworks are separate. So the framework will be what's reported in the report card site, including IRI, and the school identification will use the school achievement and or growth for ISAT, English Language Arts, and Math. Dawn says, we like the percent of students achieving their IEP goals. That would meet the ESSA requirements for consistency in subgroups. That's an interesting one, and we'll take that back to the special ed team and have them pull that out a little bit. And Nick, you're welcome on the clarification. Certainly, if you have any questions after this, because we are at the 11 o'clock hour, and we know your time is valuable. So we want to let you go if you're ready to drop off. But we will answer all of these questions. We'll take them offline, answer them, and post them after this webinar. And this webinar has been recorded, so we will also include the recording. So if you'd like to go back and revisit anything, or if any of your colleagues were unable to attend and you'd like them to participate or at least hear the information we've shared today and follow up with any other questions, you can certainly send those in. Duncan and I can share our, I don't know if it's on the last slide, contact information or email addresses. There's also places on the website where you can look at the plan and you can submit your feedback there. But if you have offline questions, you can certainly email me or Duncan. And Lori, we're glad you were able to join us, and thank you. We will follow up. We hope to see you all next Thursday. In the meantime, if there are no other questions, have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.